Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is...
Murder Coaster.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to part 2 of John Wayne Gacy, the Killer Clown. Prepare for a rough ride into the mind of this terrifying psychopath, where in the end we begin to examine the disturbing ties he had with Dean Coral, the Candyman, and the evidence that he may not have been working alone. Proceed at your own risk. Discretion is advised.
Let's begin. Chapter 1. Mother's Day. On Mother's Day, 1975, Carol Gacy was surprised by the tenderness and kindness of her husband, John. They had been constantly arguing, the relationship growing fraught. They'd often fight about the smell under the house, she insisting there had to be something dead under there, he saying there wasn't, that the problem had been a broken sewage line, but he'd fixed it. The flies that had permeated the house were gone. And there wasn't a constant stink, but still, sometimes, when the furnace kicked on, a stench would come blasting out with the heat. And on other days, especially when it rained, an ominous, rank odor would rise up from the floorboards. But John would say it was just the way the wet clay soil smelled in that area, and he'd go spread lime to counteract the acidic clay. Eventually, dumping 800 pounds of lime in the crawl space.
But on Mother's Day of 1975, they didn't fight at all. John took her out to dinner, bought her flowers, then led her by the hand to the bedroom, where he tenderly kissed and caressed her before he gently made love to her.
It had been a long time since the couple had been intimate, and for Carol, it just felt so good to be held and loved, cared for. Afterwards, John caressed her face and whispered to her,
"Hey, happy Mother's Day, Carol, and I want you to know that that's the last time we'll ever have sex."
"What?" Carol said. "What did you say?"
I said, that's the last time we'll ever have sex.
"You've got to be kidding."
Nope, that was the last time.
And it was. John Wayne Gacy had reached a turning point. He only wanted to have sex with men and teenage boys. Didn't have time for women.
He tried to explain it away by saying having sex with a woman was just too much work. You had to wine and dine them, make them feel special, lay in bed and kiss and caress them, work so hard to satisfy them. With a guy, especially the young hustlers at the Greyhound bus station and Bughouse Square, it was a quick, emotionless thing. 10 minutes tops. He was a busy man and didn't have time for sex with women. All the emotions and stuff. Sex with a man was raw, animalistic, and emotionless. Just a step up from masturbation, really.
And so the spring of 1975 moved forward. Carol feeling lonely and abandoned by her husband, desperate to please him, yet hopeless. And as the days grew longer and summer approached, the land growing warmer, the crawl space again began to smell, and the flies returned.
Chapter 2. Pogo the Clown and the Chicago Democratic Party.
One of John's neighbors was a Democratic precinct captain, and John schmoozed him, grew friendly with him, and eventually volunteered to be his assistant. Working in the precinct, John then met Robert Martwick, the Democratic Township Committeeman, and as John would say,
I figured that I could never really run for office because of Iowa. They dig that up. What I wanted to be was the advisor, like the power behind the throne.
John would have his teenage employees clean the Democratic headquarters and make repairs, set up the chairs for meetings, use his work trucks to haul office supplies. He even painted and redecorated the entire headquarters for free.
And it all paid off. John was appointed Democratic precinct captain for the 21st Precinct, Norwood Park Township. He'd go door to door, getting out the vote, asking folks what the Democratic Party could do to make their lives easier. And soon everyone in Norwood Park knew who John Wayne Gacy was, and that he had important political connections.
Then he was named the director of Chicago's annual Polish Constitution Day Parade, a daunting project, as John himself would say.
Imagine trying to get 10,000 Polacks to march in unison. God in heaven, it was something.
John ran the parade like a military operation. Every float, every band, every set of marchers was numbered, everything planned out like clockwork, and a flood of politicians wanted in on the parade, and they all had to go through John Wayne Gacy. And that's how he met Mayor Richard Daley, making sure to get a photograph of the two together he could prominently display in his house.
And all the while, he was still very active in the River Grove Moose Lodge, schmoozing, making connections, and proudly showing pornography for prominent businessmen.
The Moose Lodge also ran the Jolly Joker Clown Club, an organization which supplied clowns for children's events, and John joined and invented a persona for himself, Pogo the Clown. He bought grease paint and wigs and had an outfit professionally made.
The Jolly Jokers would perform to children's hospitals, perform for holiday parties, and were featured in up to 20 different parades during the summer, all for free, to show their commitment to the community. John also clowned at the Democratic Organization picnic and at various fundraising events.
One of John's fellow jesters described him as a fantastic clown, saying, "He prepared and planned entertainment. He used a series of 2 hand puppets, professionally made, very realistic. One, a little skunk that made the kids laugh. John could get the shyest children to talk to the squeaky-voiced skunk. He also had a rubber chicken he used."
John himself said, I never went to clown school. It just came naturally to me. In a way, I guess you could say, I just love to perform. Maybe Pogo was a way of running away from myself. I enjoyed making people happy. The clowning was relaxation for me. I enjoyed entertaining kids. Like, some people unwind in different ways. By going out drinking or that, I can put on clown makeup. I was relaxed. We would visit different hospitals and entertain the children there. And we didn't entertain them with handcuffs or anything like that. We used, balloon animals, toys, things like that.
John says he came up with the name Pogo because Po stands for Polish, and go because he was a man always on the go. Pogo. I never actually realized that he came up with this. I thought it was already a clown persona that existed and he took it on. I don't know why I thought that.
And he also came up with patches.
Yeah, it's wild.
He's really into it.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Pogo was his happy clown, the good clown. There was also Patches, the sad clown. This clown would later be taken up by his assistant, Michael Rossi, whom we'll get to soon.
One thing clown enthusiasts often point out is that clowns aren't supposed to have sharp edges in their makeup. Everything is supposed to be round with soft edges. But the mouth of Pogo came up into sharp points like knives, as did the triangular eyes. Professional clowns say the sharp edges can look scary, frighten children. But John said he didn't mind scaring the kids just a little.
Chapter 3. Wrestling is overcoming obstacles.
No more despair. I have paid more than I owe. Now what you see is what I give you, Sonny. And one of my prayers, I have asked for light.
Tony Antonucci was a high school wrestling champion and longtime employee of PDM. He'd met John Wayne Gacy when John was remodeling his parents' house. He was a strong kid with an easy smile and a good sense of humor. Disturbingly, he'd unknowingly dug the grave of Gacy's second victim there by the barbecue pit.
Tony was used to John's weirdness and his sexual advances. He tried to laugh them off, though sometimes they'd go too far. Once, while helping clean the Democratic headquarters on Montrose Avenue, John had become so aggressive, pinching him, pulling at his pants, trying to fondle him, that Tony had picked up a chair and threatened to bash John right over the head if he didn't knock it off. John, like always, just laughed and said, I'm just testing you, making sure you're not one of them queers.
Behold and beware. Further up the road, guess we will see. Maybe we won't dream no longer. I never dream of murder again.
One night, Tony was at home, recuperating after having stepped on a nail, his parents out of town, when John Wayne Gacy showed up unannounced at his door.
John was drunk and had a few bottles of wine with him. He told Tony he had his film projector in his car and some new Swedish pornography he'd picked up. Tony want to watch some movies? Straight stuff. Women, none of that queer shit.
Tony, a red-blooded teenage boy at a time when pornography was hard to come by, agreed.
Afterwards, Gacy drunkenly challenged Tony to a wrestling match, grabbing him in a headlock and telling him, "Hey, kid, you're not so tough."
Tony was on the wrestling team and easily outmaneuvered his overweight drunken boss, but was careful not to humiliate him too badly, taking it easy on him, when suddenly he heard a clicking sound and realized Gacy had somehow got a handcuff on his wrist, then bent his arms behind his back and snapped the cuffs on his other wrist as well. Once his arms were cuffed behind him, John then swept his legs out from under him and knocked him to the floor.
As Tony lay there, handcuffed on the floor, John Wayne Gacy silently unbuckled the boy's pants and pulled them down. Then, as if in a daze, wandered into the kitchen.
Tony could feel one of the cuffs was very loose and managed to slip his hand free, but continued to lay there. When Gacy returned, Tony leapt up and, quote, hit him with a beautiful double-leg takedown, end quote, slamming him to the ground, pinning him there, retrieving the handcuff key, and slapping the cuffs on his boss.
As John Wayne Gacy now lay there on the ground, handcuffed, he looked up at the teenager and said, "Wow, You know what? Not only are you the only one that got out of the cuffs, you got them on me.
It was an ominous thing to say, filled with dark implications. But after securing a promise that he'd leave, Tony uncuffed his boss, who packed up his pornography and film projector, and slipped off into the night.
Chapter 4. Little John. John Bukovich was a 16-year-old high school dropout, working in a hardware store, when John Wayne Gacy offered him a job in construction. Gacy would say of him, he was a good kid, learned fast.
John Bukovich soon ingratiated himself with the family. As Carol would say, he was a very nice boy. He was over often, spent a lot of time with us, would have dinner and play with Tammy and April.
Kind and sweet kid. When Gacy's mother eventually moved to Arkansas, John Bukovich even helped her move.
John Bukovich became such a part of the family and business that they took to calling him Little John. Big John, or Papa John, of course, being John Wayne Gacy.
But Big John could be a hard guy to work for, always arguing and yelling, which he said was necessary, saying, hey, you have to do it. I have to keep them in line. I have to make sure they know I'm the boss. Otherwise, they'll take me for granted.
Often they argued about money, Papa John feeling like his minions were always trying to rip him off. As Carol would later say, Big John always felt that the boys would end up putting too many hours on the card. So it was a little argument over the hours that Little John spent on the job that Big John didn't think he did.
On July 31st, 1975, Carol and her daughters were in Arkansas, visiting John's mother and sister, when Little John showed up at Gacy's house with 3 friends, saying that if Big John didn't pay him what he owed him, he was going to report him to the authorities for not deducting taxes from employee earnings.
But Big John took out paperwork and invoices showing that Little John had used the PDM account to get a discount on carpeting for his father's apartment building and never paid the money back. Even with the pay deduction, Little John still owed Big John $300. It was all there on paper.
Finally, a settlement was reached where Little John agreed to take the carpeting back. And once the money was refunded, then Gacy said he'd pay him. So, after smoking a joint, Little John and his 3 friends left.
Later that night, as John Wayne Gacy circled the bus station in Bughouse Square, who should he see but Little John Bukovich, who waved him down, saying he wanted to talk.
They were both completely wasted, and they headed back to Big John's house to drink some more. Gacy claims that back at the house, Little John became belligerent, saying he could kick his ass, and again started demanding money, threatening to tear the place apart.
So Big John pulled the handcuff trick on him, tricking him into the handcuffs and saying,
now you ain't gonna be kicking anybody's ass. You just relax. I don't take the cuffs off until you sober up. Could take all night.
John claims he sat with the manacled teenager for a while, got blacked out drunk, and then woke up in the morning in his bed with a blinding hangover. When he walked into the living room, there was little John, lying dead with a rope around his neck.
He claims that the boy was fully dressed. He hadn't been sexually violated and tortured, and he had no memory of killing him. But John Wayne Gacy was a notorious liar. Little John Bekovich was exactly his type. Slight and small, yet muscular. Strawberry blonde, elfish, wearing tight jeans.
John rolled the body up into a rubber tarp and stashed it in the garage. Carol came home the next day, putting him in a bind. How was he going to get the body into the crawl space and bury it with his wife and stepdaughters in the house?
But there was a small hole in the floor of the garage where John had been planning to put in a drain, just 3 feet by 1.5 feet. After digging down as far as he could, little John just barely fit in the hole, and Gacy had to jump up and down on the stiff body to cram it in there, bending and folding it to the cramped space unnaturally twisted up, before he covered it with concrete and forgot all about it, telling Carol that little John had quit and run away from home, headed to California.
Little John had a 1968 Dodge that he adored, usually keeping it in the garage. So when his father discovered the car sitting on the corner of Sheridan and Lawrence in downtown Chicago with the keys in the ignition, he knew something was terribly wrong. Inside the car was Little John's wallet with $40 inside.
The police were called and did a cursory investigation, coming out to the plains and interviewing John Wayne Gacy, who told them how little John had come to his home with 3 friends, but then left, and all 3 of his friends confirmed the story.
So the police told Little John's parents that he was most likely a runaway, and at 17 he was no longer considered a juvenile and entitled to leave home if he wished. There was nothing they could do.
Every week, little John's parents would call the police saying, "Who runs away and leaves their car and wallet?" begging them to check out this Gacy character that he had worked for. But the police told them that 20,000 missing person reports are filled out in Chicago every year. They can't investigate all of them.
Eventually, police just refused to take any more calls from the frantic parents, and that was that. Chapter 5. The Divorce.
After the Mother's Day surprise, Carol knew a divorce was coming. John was just looking for excuses to fight with her at this point, and the straw that broke the camel's back was the checkbook argument in October of 1975.
Trying to be of help, Carol had begun doing odd chores for PDM, picking up hardware, dropping building inspection forms off, and balancing the checkbook.
And the big issue was, if Carol made a mistake on a check, instead of writing void across it and keeping it for records, she would simply tear it up and throw it away. And this drove John mad.
One night, John, sitting at his desk and trying to balance the books, receipts and checks spread out before him, he began to verbally berate her, saying,
"Carol, you don't throw away voided checks, for Christ's sake! How is anyone going to make sense of this? Where is check 1230? Where is check 1238? 1242? Huh? Where are the goddamn fucking checks, Carol?"
Carol was weeping. getting hysterical, saying, "I didn't want to do this in the first place. I can't do anything right."
Don't give me that crying shit. Don't lay that crap on me. You don't want to learn. You're dumb and stupid because you don't listen.
I listen. I know you'd rather hang around with your employees than with me and the girls. I know some things.
You know jack shit. You have no idea how hard I work for you. How hard I work for the girls. You won't work with me. If I had some fucking help around here, I'd have time for you. You're so goddamn dumb. You don't even understand.
It would be the same whatever I did.
All you do is bitch. Bitch from the time I walk in the door. If I was out banging every other broad in town, you'd have a reason to bitch. If I was gambling away our money or drinking it up or buying drugs with it, you'd have a reason to bitch. But I'm working. I'm working my ass off 7 days a week, fucking 20 hours a day. Jesus Christ, Carol. What the fuck do you want from me?
I want a divorce.
Chapter 6, 1976.
(1976) was the United States' 200th birthday, the bicentennial. The year began with John and Carol becoming officially divorced. But John was still kind and friendly, actually helping Carol find a new place and move into it.
And now, the house was all his, to do whatever he wanted in.
The first thing John did was buy a brand new black Delta 88 Oldsmobile, attaching red and white spotlights on it, and a pair of large CB antennas on the trunk, all of which made the car look like an unmarked police car.
John would take the car out to Bughouse Square, roaming the dark and dangerous streets in the wee hours of the morning, looking for teenage hustlers, telling them he was a homicide detective named Jack Hanley. Later, he'd claim that Jack Hanley was more than just a persona and ruse he'd used to abduct teens. It was an actual personality that would take over his body.
On April 6th, the 18-year-old Daryl Sampson went missing. He'd be found buried in the crawl space under the dining room.
On May 14th, 15-year-old Randall Reffett disappeared shortly after returning home from a dental appointment. Hours later, his friend 14-year-old Samuel Stapleton vanished as he walked home from his sister's apartment. They are believed to be the first of what Gacy called his doubles, when he killed 2 boys at once. They were found buried together, one atop the other, in the same grave.
On June 10th, William Carroll disappeared into thin air. Then Rick Johnston never came home from a rock concert at the Aragon Ballroom.
On June 3rd, 17-year-old Michael Bonin disappeared while traveling from Chicago to Waukegan. His body was found buried under the spare bedroom. 10 days later, 16-year-old William Carroll went missing, the first of 4 victims known to have been murdered between June 13 and August 6, 1976. 3 were between 16 and 17 years old, and 1 unidentified victim appears to have been an adult.
On August 5th, 16-year-old James Hackinson phoned his family, possibly from Gacy's home, and was never seen alive again. His body was buried in the crawl space beneath 17-year-old Rick Johnston, who was last seen alive on August 6th.
Gacy is thought to have murdered 2 unidentified males between August and October 1976. On October 24th, Gacy abducted and killed teenage friends Kenneth Parker and Michael Marino. The 2 were last seen on Clark Street in downtown Chicago. 2 days later, 19-year-old construction worker William Bundy disappeared. After informing his family he was to attend a party. His body was found beneath the master bedroom.
Gacy would later claim that he had no idea how all the bodies got under his house, that he was completely innocent of murder, saying,
"Hey, the only thing I'm guilty of is running a funeral parlor without a license."
But he did make confessions both before and after being arrested, to his lawyers, to investigating officer Albrecht, and to the prosecutor Larry Fiechter, giving grisly details of what he did.
That and the testimony of survivors gives us a good idea of his basic methods. And content warning here, be prepared. We are entering deeply disturbing territory.
John Wayne Gacy had followed the case of the Candyman, Dean Corll, in the papers, studying it. Like Dean Corll, he'd used the promise of marijuana and alcohol to lead boys to his home. And exactly like the Candyman, once he had them in his lair, he'd perform the handcuff trick, deceiving them into putting on a pair of handcuffs, incapacitating them, especially if their hands were cuffed behind their back. Once they had the cuffs on, they were all his.
He'd begin just by laughing at them, insulting them, belittling them, dehumanizing them, telling them how dumb they were, calling them assholes. Then he'd take off their pants and perform oral sex on them, demanding that they tell him how much they liked it, often bringing them to orgasm, which in his mind, so he says, proved that it was all consensual, saying, "Hey, nobody gets off unless they like it."
Which is not true, and is a horrible thing that's often brought up in rape cases. The truth is, human beings of both genders often can't control their orgasms, and it is not a sign of consent.
John Wayne would then show them the pony trick. He'd sit on their chests, riding them like they were a pony, using their hair for reins, and force them to perform oral sex on him. Again, forcing them to say that they liked it, saying that this too proved it was all consensual. Saying, if they didn't like it, they'd have bit off my dick. How can oral sex not be consensual?
Also not true. These young men and teenagers were terrified for their lives and helplessly bound, desperate for escape and willing to do anything to be free.
He then attached their feet to a length of 2x4, spreading their legs apart, spread eagle, leaving them utterly, completely incapacitated, very similar to how Dean Corll would strap his victims to a sheet of plywood. He then tortured them with various sex toys and strange objects, like candles, finally raping them.
Afterwards, he'd then smoke a cigar and burn them with it. Often at this point, the boys would begin to beg him to just kill them, finish them off as they couldn't take the pain anymore.
John Wayne Gacy would then drag them to the bathroom, where he'd bathe them, before he'd repeatedly submerge their heads underwater in the bathtub, telling them they needed to be purified. Invariably, the boys would cry out to God to help them, and Gacy would tell them, "Yes, child, God is here. God the Father, God the monster, God is here for us."
And then John Wayne Gacy, who, remember, had harbored dreams of being a Catholic priest, would begin to quote scripture, often the 23rd Psalm, saying to the boys as they cried out to God to save them,
"The Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table for me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever."
He'd then drag them back to the bedroom and say,
Well, kid, I gotta get up early tomorrow. Time for you to get out.
Invariably, the boy would say, "I'll go. I won't tell anyone, I promise."
I know you won't tell, because there's one more trick. You'll love this. It's the rope trick. This is the last trick. When we're done, I'll drive you home, okay?
Okay.
As he wrapped the length of rope around their neck, John would tell them that the rope trick was a means of heightening sexual stimulation that would make them get off, give them a hard-on.
Sex and strangulation do have physical links. When the carotid artery is blocked and blood ceases to flow to the brain, it can greatly heighten erotic feelings. It can also cause a spontaneous erection in men, sometimes even an orgasm. The old myth of a hanged man sexually climaxing is based on truth. It can happen, though there's obviously no pleasure or joy in it, as the outcome is death.
John would tie the rope in a simple granny knot behind the head, and then insert the hammer handle, tie it off again. Basically a tourniquet, a trick he learned in the Boy Scouts to stop bleeding. He turned the handle once, talking to them all the while, asking them if it was too tight, if they felt the blood flow to their brain lessening, if it was getting them off, getting them hard, telling them people do this all the time. Erotic asphyxiation's what it's called.
As they began to gasp, he'd then slowly turn the hammer handle again, asking how that felt, asking if they could take just one more turn.
Just one more turn. One more. You can take that, can't you? And as the killer clown would crank the handle one more time, now completely cutting off all air and blood, sending them into spasms, he'd stuff their underwear down their throat, deep, as far as he could cram it, to stop post-mortem fluids from leaking from them. Sometimes this would cause them to gag and vomit, the vomit filling their lungs and causing them to drown in their own retch.
Neighbors would later report waking up in the middle of the night, hearing horrible screaming, sometimes so loud and panicked to cause the dogs to start barking. They could never tell exactly where it was coming from, but it was always in the vicinity of John Wayne Gacy's house.
Gacy would deny being a necrophile, but he would deny a lot of things. He would deny he engaged in anal sex. He'd even deny being a murderer at all. But during his first confessions, he did say he sometimes take the bodies into the garage and practice mortuary techniques on them. And he often slept beside the dead bodies, putting them right into his own bed at night.
Although we can't confirm his necrophilia, we do know he found being by dead bodies comforting and erotic, something he'd been doing since way back when he was just a teenager, working at a mortuary in Las Vegas.
Chapter 7. Michael Rossi.
Tomorrow, a point of no return.
Michael Rossi was a 16-year-old high school dropout, working for a plumbing contractor who came to Gacy's house to help install a new dishwasher. Michael was only 5'7", 150 pounds, with light brown hair, freckled and boyish, a look that Gacy would often say he was attracted to, what he looked for when picking up rough trade.
Michael was only working part-time for the plumber, who was a friend of John's, so Gacy offered him a full-time job and Michael accepted.
According to Gacy, he'd invited Michael over one night. They had a few drinks, smoked some weed, and John showed him the handcuff trick.
After filleting the 16-year-old, John did the pony trick, sitting on his chest and forcing him to perform oral sex on him. But then, as he'd really taken a liking to the kid, he let him go. He didn't torture him, he didn't rape him, he didn't show him the deadly rope trick.
Afterwards, they had a few more drinks, John laughing the whole thing off, telling him nothing is wrong unless you make it wrong in your head, and that a sexual relationship would ensure Michael would rise to the top of PDM, get bonuses, and more, saying,
"Hey, business is a process of mutual benefit. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours."
And the next morning, bright and early, Michael Rossi showed up for work, right on time, as if nothing had happened.
John asked him, "Hey, what'd you think of the handcuff trick?" And Rossi told him he'd contemplated finding a gun and killing him, but said, in the end, he decided he needed the job, needed the money, and wanted to get ahead.
But according to Michael Rossi, none of that ever happened. He testified under oath that he never fell for the handcuff trick and never engaged in sexual activity with John Wayne Gacy.
Did Michael Rossi and John Wayne Gacy develop a sexual relationship? Well, we don't really know, but I personally think so. John Wayne Gacy was obviously unable to control himself. But that's neither here nor there. The real question is, did Michael Rossi help John Wayne Gacy secure victims and aid in their torture, death, and burials, just as Elmer Wayne Henley had done for Dean Corll?
Again, we just don't know for certain. Gacy claims he did. Gacy would even go a step further and claim 16-year-old Michael Rossi was the real killer, burying bodies in the crawl space on his own, putting them down there without his knowledge.
What we do know for certain is that Michael Rossi did become John's right-hand man, becoming a foreman at PDM, head of his own little crew of workers. And he moved in with John, staying in the same room David Cram had lived in before leaving.
Michael Rossi would even don his own clown suit and go clowning with John under the persona of Patches.
Yes, Michael Rossi is living there in the house of death and torture with John Wayne Gacy, going out clowning with him. Gacy claims that Michael Rossi would have sex with him on command, saying, "Whenever I wanted it, but no kissing, no fondling, none of that ugly shit. I dominate him, order him around, say, 'Get on it, Rossi, right now.'"
Gacy says he'd reward Michael for sex by letting him use the car and giving him a few bucks. Gacy even claims that Michael would tease him and get him hot and bothered before requesting something.
John hired another kid with that same look he liked so much, Greg Godzik, who was 5'7" and slight, yet with a wiry, muscular build. He was 17 with the wisp of a mustache and wore tight jeans.
He worked for John and Michael for 3 weeks before going missing and never being seen alive again.
Gacy later claims that they got in an argument over a pot deal. And he got blacked out drunk, and when he woke up in the morning, Greg was sitting in an easy chair, wearing nothing but his underwear, a rope around his neck, stiff with rigor mortis. So he dumped him into a hole that Greg himself had dug in the crawl space, supposedly for a tile drain, and forgot all about him.
Greg Godzik had literally dug his own grave. Gacy kept his school ring as a memento.
Just like John Bakovich, Greg's car was found abandoned, and his parents went to the police, telling them all about this contractor, John Gacy, he'd been working for. And now you may be wondering why the police didn't put the disappearances of John Bakovich and Greg Godzik together, both working for John Wayne Gacy. But the truth is, they didn't realize it at all, because Bakovich's family was calling the police's Area 6 department, and the Godzik family was calling the Area 5 department. And the two police departments had no communication between them.
Though the two missing teenagers were both considered runaways, and the fact that they'd both worked for the same convicted sex offender wasn't even noticed.
And further complicating things, Gacy then told the police that he'd received a message on his answering machine from Greg after the disappearance, which the police took as proof that the teenager was still alive. John told them he'd play the message for them, but he'd accidentally erased it. And they believed him, even telling Greg's parents that they had irrefutable proof that he was still alive.
The Godzik family would spend a fortune on one of Chicago's most elite private investigators. They never found a clue. The boy had just disappeared without a trace.
Francis Alexander was a 21-year-old hippie who told his mother he was thinking of moving to California. So, no one really noticed when he went missing, his parents assuming he was just off in California. But the truth was, he never made it out of Chicago and ended up in the crawl space beneath the killer clown's house.
Chapter 8, 1977.
Am I breathing this in and choking you out by the seat of the mountain spruce? Have anything to do with you, my feelings, some strange power to choose.
On January 20th, 1977, Gacy lured 19-year-old John Cizik to his house on the pretext of buying his white Plymouth Satellite. He then strangled him to death in the spare room while Michael Rossi was sleeping on the sofa in the living room. Very suspicious.
Even more suspicious, Gacy then told Michael Rossi he'd sell him this random car. And on the pink slip, they spelled Gacy's name wrong and fudged on the VIN number as well. Life was simpler and scarier before computers.
And Gacy sold Michael Rossi John Cizik's car for $300, less than half of what it was worth. But Rossi didn't even have that much money, so Gacy let him pay it off, just as his father had done for him. Aw, ain't that sweet.
In the trunk of the car was a clock radio and portable television, which Gacy kept for himself.
2 months later, on March 15th, 20-year-old John Prestige, a tourist from Kalamazoo, Michigan, walked out of a Northside restaurant saying he was going to check out this bughouse square everyone was always talking about, and was never seen again. As Gacy was beginning to run out of room, he was buried atop Francis Alexander. John Wayne Gacy was beginning to stack the bodies.
Another unidentified youth was buried in the crawl space in the spring or early summer of 1977. On July 5th, 19-year-old Matthew Bauman disappeared after his mother dropped him off at a suburban train station so that he could go to Harwood Heights for a court appointment.
18-year-old Robert Gilroy disappeared on September 15th, hitchhiking to a horse stables. Russell Nelson, a 21-year-old college student from Minnesota, newly engaged, was visiting friends in Chicago and went to a disco on October 17th, never to be seen alive again.
In November 1977, Michael Rossi was arrested for stealing gasoline while driving Cizik's car. The gas station attendant noted the license plate, and police traced the car to Gacy's house. When questioned, Gacy told officers that Cizik had sold the car to him in February, saying he needed money to leave town. The police did not pursue the matter further, although they did inform Cizik's mother that her son had sold his car.
Robert Gilroy's father was a police sergeant, and he only lived 4 blocks from John Wayne Gacy. On September 15th, 1977, he vanished into thin air, gone without a clue. His body would be found in the crawl space under the living room, though Gacy may have mysteriously been out of town during this murder. More on that later.
On September 25th, 19-year-old former U.S. Marine John Mowry disappeared after leaving his mother's house. His body was found beneath the master bedroom.
On October 17th, 21-year-old Russell Nelson disappeared. He was last seen outside a Chicago bar. Nelson was looking for contracting work. He'd be found buried beneath the guest bedroom.
On November 10th, 16-year-old Robert Winch went missing. 20-year-old Tommy Bowling disappeared on November 18th after leaving a Chicago bar. On December 9th, 19-year-old U.S. Marine David Talsma disappeared after telling his mother he was to attend a rock concert in Hammond, Indiana.
On December 30th, 2 days before the new year, Gacy set out in his black Oldsmobile with the spotlights, dressed in his black leather jacket, and pulled up to 19-year-old college student Robert Donnelly at a bus stop, flashing a badge at him and telling him, "Hey, get in the car."
When the college student balked at his request, Gacy pulled out a gun and ordered him to get in the car, cuffing his hands behind him.
Gacy took him to his house, strapped his feet to the 2x4, tortured and raped him, then showed him a new trick, the gun trick.
He dramatically took his revolver and put a single bullet in the cylinder before spinning it and slamming it shut. He then began to play Russian roulette with him, putting the barrel to his temple and squeezing the trigger, click, squeezing the trigger, click, until finally the round went off.
But it was all an act, a clown trick. The round was a blank. He then dragged him to the bathroom for the water trick. And began dunking his head underwater, saying, "Aren't we playing fun games tonight, huh? You like my fun games?"
The teenager began begging Gacy to just kill him, to which Gacy replied,
"Yeah, I'm getting round to it."
Eventually, Gacy, who was now beginning to run out of grave space, drove him back to the city, warning him not to tell anyone, saying the police would never believe him anyway.
But Robert Donnelly did go to the police and report the assault, and led them to Gacy, and police questioned Gacy on January 6, 1978. But Gacy told them, "Yeah, we have a sex-slave relationship. He's into that kinky shit. He likes being abused, treated like a slave. But it was all consensual. And I didn't pay the kid. So he got all mad and called you guys."
Police believed him and filed no charges.
19-year-old William Kindred wasn't tall by any means, only 5'8", but he was muscular and tough. A streetwise kid everyone called Shotgun.
Shotgun headed off for a bar one night, wearing a religious medal on a chain his fiancée had given him, happy and carefree, and disappeared into thin air. The religious medal would later help in identifying his corpse.
William Shotgun Kindred was the final victim buried in the crawl space. There was now just absolutely no more room for corpses in the house of horror and death and clowns.
Chapter 9. The First Lady.
On May 6, 1978, the annual Polish Constitution Parade was held. And again, John Wayne Gacy was in charge of the entire event. And that year, the guest of honor was none other than First Lady Rosalind Carter, wife of President Jimmy Carter.
To this day, it is unknown how John Wayne Gacy, a felon and convicted sex offender, passed Secret Service scrutiny and received the special pin that gave him clearance to be near the president's wife. But it happened. John recalls the incident like this.
As far as I was concerned, Rosalind Carter was just another political fly buzzing around the big turd. The Secret Service came from Washington, giving protocol of the parade. I told them, God damn it, there's a wrong way, there's a right way, and then there's my way. I've been running parades for 15 years. I've been running this parade for 3. And this is gonna be done my way.
As the parade was gearing up, a Secret Service agent came to John and told him to begin, that Mrs. Carter was ready, and the motorcade was on the way, to which John responded,
Hey, Jagoff, look at the fucking program here. What time does it say the parade starts? Does it start at 11:50? Huh? Does it start at 11:55? The motherfucking parade starts at noon sharp. So you get on your little gadget there and go tell Big Rosie that the bastard starts at noon. She can sit in the car. She can ride around the block. I give a shit. But she gets here at noon sharp. And then the fucking parade starts.
The parade went without a hitch, like clockwork. Some cops came up to John, impressed, and said it was more military than the Marines. And John told them that had been his branch of service, a bold-faced lie he'd made from time to time. If you remember from last week, John Gacy had been declared 4F, unfit for military service.
Later that night, at a private reception, John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, was famously photographed shaking hands with Rosalind Carter, the wife of the President of the United States, his pin declaring him cleared by the Secret Service gleaming on his lapel.
What a night, what an image. A summation and metaphor for late 70s America, in a way both incredibly disturbing and utterly surreal at the same time.
Chapter 10. A river runs through it.
John Wayne Gacy was attending the groundbreaking ceremony for a retirement center when he ran into the new mayor, Michael Belandic, and had a friend take a picture of them shaking hands to add to his large collection of photographs with very important people.
Gacy proudly showed the picture off at that year's yard party, with the theme being Italian Festival. It was the largest party yet, filled with politicians and wealthy businessmen, all remarking what a hard worker John Wayne Gacy was, the embodiment of the American dream, showing ambition and drive was all that one needed to make it in this country.
Tim O'Rourke went out for cigarettes in June of 1978 and disappeared. His body was later found floating in the Des Plaines River, a pair of underwear jammed down his throat. Gacy had found a new dumping ground off the Des Plaines River Bridge on Interstate 294.
19-year-old Frank Landingen was last seen alive on November 4th by his father, walking along Foster Avenue. His naked body was found in an inlet in the Des Plaines River by 2 duck hunters on November 12th.
On November 24th, 20-year-old James Mazzara disappeared after Thanksgiving dinner with his family, proudly telling his sister that he'd just found a new construction job.
Chapter 11. Final Boy.
I remember the days, all those years ago that never fade away. And I remember your face when you hit the ground. I can recall the time and place on a midnight walk through the old streets, trying to turn back the clock to the days of old, back to the days when all the things we knew were made of gold. As the world moves on, time sings a song. In the old neighborhood, as the clock strikes one, the memory lives just as it stood, like a quiet dream. The shadows of that time are cast beneath the streetlight beam. As the world moves.
Robert Piest was a 15-year-old high school student working part-time at the Neeson Pharmacy in Des Plaines. He was a good-looking and well-loved kid, an athlete, an all-A student, and Boy Scout, just 2 merit badges short of becoming an Eagle Scout.
On December 11th, 1978, John Wayne Gacy happened to be in the pharmacy, giving a quote on a remodeling job, measuring shelves and studying the layout of the store, loudly telling the owner, within earshot of Robert, that he paid teenage boys a whopping $5 an hour, twice what Robert was making at the pharmacy.
It was Rob's mother's birthday, and she came to pick him up at closing to take him to the party. He grabbed his coat and told her he'd be right back. He just had to talk to a contractor about a job real quick, and never returned, disappearing into thin air.
When you watch documentaries about this case, they always call Robert Piest the good boy, the boy that was different, the one who the cops couldn't believe would run away, the one who wasn't a hustler or a druggie. And invariably, nearly all documentaries begin with his abduction. But come on, this is bullshit. Robert Piest was no more a good boy than Greg Godzik, who came from a very loving home and whose parents never stopped searching for him and spent a fortune on a private investigator. Or any better than John Cizik or any number of the other completely run-of-the-mill 70s teenagers that were slain by John Wayne Gacy and completely ignored by the police. The only real difference was the brazenness of the crime and the utterly strange manner that Robert just disappeared in front of a crowd.
His mother was right there, waiting for him to return, and an entire pharmacy full of people could confirm this. He was on his way to a birthday party, so the cops took this one a little more seriously, especially one Lieutenant Kozensak, whose son went to the same high school as Robert.
They began looking for this elusive contractor Robert told his mother he was running outside to talk to, one John Wayne Gacy. And looking into him, they discovered that old sodomy charge in Iowa, as well as the alleged assaults on Robert Donnelly and Jeffrey Rignall, coming to realize that John Wayne Gacy was a convicted sex offender who preyed on teenage boys. Finally! Ugh!
They went to Gacy's home to interview him, knocking on the front door. They could see lights on, detect movement inside, knew someone was in there, but no one came to the door. Then a van with PDM contractors printed on the side pulled up into the slushy driveway. Driven by Michael Rossi, Patches the Clown.
Rossi told the officers to use the back door, as Gacy was probably watching television and never answered the front door.
So the cops went around back, where they could see Gacy through the window.
Gacy was dismissive, saying he'd never talked to any teenager at the pharmacy, had no idea where this kid could have gone or even who he was. Then he said he didn't have time to talk, as his uncle had just died and he was handling the funeral arrangements, had to make an important phone call.
The police officers told him they'd wait while he made the call, which he did, calling the funeral home, growing visibly upset as he did. By the time he'd finished his business and hung up the phone, he was trembling with anger and exploded, asking the officers,
"Don't you have no respect for the dead?"
The officers told him that since he'd been in the pharmacy when the teenager went missing, they needed him to fill out a few witness forms. Gacy agreed and said he'd meet them at the station later that night, and they left.
Little did they know that the body of Rob Peast lay right above their heads the entire time, in the attic, where Gacy had put him for safekeeping.
The day before, as Gacy sat in his car, Rob Peast had indeed run up to him, asking about a job, and Gacy had lured him back to his house, saying it would only take a minute to fill out an application form.
Gacy then began telling the Boy Scout and All-A student that he could make some good money hustling, selling his body, working himself his rough trade. When the teen ignored him, Gacy says he thought he was leading him on and playing with him. So he showed him the old handcuff trick, and the dumb kid fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. The trick is, you gotta have the key, you stupid asshole.
Gacy said Robert was crying like a baby and terrified by the time they got to the rope trick, and that in the middle of it, he'd had to take an important business call, and when he returned, the teen was dead. So he put him in his bed and slept beside him. In the morning, he'd shoved him up in the attic.
After the police left, Gacy went up to the attic, hauled the body down, put it in the trunk of his black Oldsmobile and drove south on Interstate 294, through the ice and snow of the cold December night, to the Des Plaines Bridge, where he dumped his last 3 victims and dropped him into the cold, black waters.
Speeding back to town for his police interview, Gacy spun out of control on the icy road and ended up in a ditch. The killer clown worked at getting himself out, at one point jacking the car up and putting the spare tire under it for traction. but he only managed to get himself more stuck. By the time a tow truck arrived, both he and the car were covered in mud.
Gacy didn't make it to the Des Plaines police station until after 3 a.m, at which point the officers who wanted to talk to him had all long gone home.
Gacy returned at noon the next day. He sat there bragging about his political connections, saying his business was making $1 million a year, which it wasn't, about a quarter of that, which was still damn good money for the late 70s, but Gacy always had to lie and exaggerate. The truth was never good enough. All the while, police were busy getting a search warrant for his home drawn up and signed by a judge.
When the warrant was complete, they asked for the keys to his house, and a surprised Gacy balked at first. But when they told him if he didn't give them the keys, they just kicked the door in, he finally capitulated and handed them over, telling them, "Hey, don't mess anything up."
Police were hoping they might find Rob Piest alive in the house, held captive. They were sadly mistaken. They did find some tantalizing clues, though, as well as some very disturbing evidence.
There was drugs, a plethora of pills that appeared stolen, some weed, a scale, lots of porn, including reels of Swedish pornography films that he no doubt proudly showed at the Moose Lodge, a high school ring with the initials JAS, handcuffs, chains, padlocks, a section of 2x4 with holes drilled in the ends that appeared to be a restraining device, and a 24-inch dildo encrusted with fecal matter.
In the attic, hidden beneath insulation, they discovered an array of different police badges and a bizarre collection of erotica, books with titles like Pretty Boys Must Die, Tight Teenagers, Bike Boy, The Great White Swallow, Pederasty, Sex Between Men and Boys, and Pedophilia, a study of adult-child sexual relations.
Officers went into the crawl space, which was damp and had a sewage-like smell to it, but the earth, covered in a thin layer of lime, was undisturbed. There were no fresh holes, no signs of any recent activity. Gacy had long ago stopped using it as a burial site, having run out of room.
In the kitchen trash can, they found a photo receipt from ASIN Pharmacy. This would be the biggest clue.
While working at the pharmacy, Rob Piest had loaned his jacket to a salesgirl, who'd absent-mindedly put her photo receipt in the pocket of his coat. The receipt had come from the pocket of Rob Piest's coat, and now they had actual physical evidence that Rob Piest had indeed been in John Wayne Gacy's house.
As they were searching the house, who should pull up but David Cram in the PDM pickup? Remember David from episode 1? The tough Chicago kid who had fallen for the handcuff trick while Gacy was dressed as Pogo, but had managed to beat the shit out of him and escape? Despite all this, David continued working for the killer clown.
And as Gacy's vehicles were then impounded to be searched, it was David Cram who picked up John from the police station.
Officers interviewed Carol, who told them about the constant stream of teenage boys, and that John Wayne Gacy hated the term jagoff, and she was forbidden to use the term near him.
She told them they should interview Little John Bukovich, who'd been so close to Gacy and the family, and officers realized that John Bukovich had gone missing 3 years earlier.
Then they learned another PDM employee had gone missing, Greg Godzik.
Then they tracked down the high school ring with the initials JAS and found it belonged to a missing teenager, John A. Cizik, whose white Plymouth Satellite was now being driven by Michael Rossi.
It was becoming incredibly clear that any time a teenage boy came within the vicinity of John Wayne Gacy, they'd disappear.
Chapter 12, Surveillance. The next day, December 14th, investigators decided that John Wayne Gacy should be put under 24-hour surveillance, his every movement tracked, which began an insane and legendary game of cat and mouse.
Almost immediately, Gacy was aware that he was being followed. He invited the officers to eat with him in a restaurant. They accepted the offer. He asked them if they were feds investigating drugs. They told him no, they were local police investigating the disappearance of a teenager.
Well, shit, Gacy said. I already talked to the Des Plaines police about that. Gave them a signed statement. I don't know nothing about no missing kid, and I'm gonna take a lie detector test for y'all. You're barking up the wrong tree. Hell, I'm a precinct captain. I'm a registered clown. I entertain bedridden children. Would a registered clown, a man who publicly loves children, have anything to do with a missing boy?
John then told them that he had leukemia and was going to die soon. Another of his many outright lies.
Gacy paid the bill for them all, then headed off to a bar, had a few drinks, and headed straight to another bar for a few more drinks, telling patrons that the undercover cops following him were his personal bodyguards.
And then he was off to yet another bar, where an intoxicated Gacy began loudly bragging about all his political connections, saying he was good friends with the mayor as well as the First Lady, Rosalind Carter.
At 5 a.m, Gacy went to a restaurant, invited the cops inside, and then began to berate them, telling them that he was going to sue the police for millions for harassment. And then he started naming notorious Chicago gangsters he was friends with, and told the officers that he had a surveillance team of his own, watching them right then, headed by a guy named Nick, who, quote, wouldn't think twice about wasting you.
The next day, Gacy begins speeding about Chicago like a madman. Thinking they could be sued for harassment if they pulled him over, the surveillance team just did their best to keep up with him as he roared down snow-covered back alleys, in and out of traffic, running red lights, skidding through the dirty slush and snow.
John, slamming beers and popping Valiums, then invited the officers back into his house, showing off the photos of him with the mayor and the First Lady, asking why they wanted to harass a poor man with leukemia. Then he told them he heard the Peace Boy was in Iowa. He was perfectly fine.
At one point, the central heat kicked in, and the smell of death came out of the vent, and the officers knew they had to get another search warrant for that crawl space.
On Wednesday, Gacy's lawyer Sam Amirante filed a $750,000 harassment suit against the Des Plaines Police Department. Now the clock was ticking. If an injunction against the police was filed, they would have to stop their surveillance and might not ever get another search warrant.
Hoping to rattle Gacy, police then made a big show out of bringing both Michael Rossi and David Cram in for questioning, which worked, really freaking Gacy out.
When Michael Rossi got home, Gacy was sitting outside his house waiting for him, telling him he'd hire him a lawyer and not to talk to the cops again, saying, "Don't be bad-mouthing me to the cops, you hear?"
It was obvious Gacy was cracking, slamming scotch, popping pills, driving like a madman. At midnight, he drove 100 miles per hour through the dark, ice-covered streets to his lawyer's office.
By now, his lawyer, Sam Amirante, had been made aware of the sodomy charge in Iowa, which he had known nothing about, as well as the pending assault charges and other missing boys. And the headline of the Daily Herald newspaper was about how missing teen Rob Peast had met with the contractor before disappearing. But Gacy still claimed he was innocent, denied everything.
Sam Amirante slammed his fist on the desk and said, quote, "Bullshit, John. Look at this paper. Look at the headline. Look at it. They think you did this. Now stop lying to me."
John asked the lawyer if he had anything to drink. And Sam pulled out a bottle of scotch, poured each of them a shot. Gacy slammed the shot, then said, "Okay, fill up my cup." Sam did, filling it to the brim.
John Wayne Gacy guzzled down the entire cup of scotch, pointed to the picture of Rob Peast in the newspaper, and said,
"This boy is dead. I've been the judge, jury, and executioner of many people. Now I'm going to be my own judge, jury, and executioner. I'm going to tell you everything."
Sam Amirante said it was the scariest night of his life, and he aged many years as John Wayne Gacy proceeded to drink the entire bottle of scotch and tell him about killing 33 young men. Afterwards, Gacy passed out on the sofa.
While Gacy slept, his lawyers invited the police inside, surprising them with kindness. Earlier, the lawyers had been openly hostile, telling police they were harassing an innocent man, filing a lawsuit against the police department. Now, they were practically begging them to arrest him.
Of course, because of attorney-client privilege, Sam couldn't tell the police what John had said, but he suggested they box his car in with their vehicles. Hell, even shoot his tires out. When suddenly John Gacy awoke, shot up, and left the building, saying he had things to do, and speeding off in his car.
Officers followed him as he drove through a school zone at breakneck speeds, dodging children, sliding through the snow and slush, finally pulling into a gas station, where the police began screaming at him for putting children in danger.
Gacy just smirked at them, until one of the officers, remembering what his ex-wife Carol had told them, called him a jag-off.
When they called him a jag-off, his demeanor completely changed. He became meek, apologetic, saying he was sorry. It's utterly bizarre. He really hated being called a jag-off.
And then Gacy went up to the service station attendant, a young guy he knew, and slipped a baggie with several joints in it into his pocket, saying,
"Take it. The end is coming. These guys, they're gonna kill me."
Right in front of the cops, who saw it all and confiscated the marijuana.
And then Gacy tore off again, sliding in the snow-slick streets, spinning into a ditch, but screeching back out, going to a cement contractor he knew, named Ron Rode.
Ron Rode was a rough, no-nonsense, blue-collar Chicago guy. Gacy said to the tough contractor,
"I just came to say goodbye to my best friend."
He began to weep.
Ron and Gacy were friendly, but far from best friends. And Ron was stunned. Gacy told him he was headed to the cemetery to visit his father's grave. Then said, "Ron, I've been a bad boy. Killed 30 people.
What? Ron asked, thinking the guy was feeding him a bunch of crap. Who? He asked. Who did you kill?
Bad people. Blackmailers."
Ron told Gacy he was full of shit, and as Gacy grabbed his jacket, a rosary fell out. And Ron shouted, "Hey, you son of a bitch, when did you get religious?"
Gacy then went back to the gas station, strode up to the owner, and said, "You always gave me good service, and I want to thank you." And then he hugged the guy, who looked over Gacy's shoulder at the cops following him, surprised and embarrassed, and rolled his eyes.
Gacy then sped off to David Cram's house, popping Valium by the handful. Michael Rossi was there as well. He told his workers that he just wanted to say goodbye, that this would be the last time they saw him, and that he'd killed over 30 people. But, he said, they were all syndicate killings he'd done for the mafia, and that he had nothing to do with the missing boys.
He then demanded that David drive him, as he was now staggering drunk and high out of his mind on Valium. So David drove him to a restaurant, and Gacy stumbled inside.
David then ran up to the cops, tailing them, and told them that Gacy had just confessed to killing over 30 people, and he was afraid he was going to kill himself and take him with him.
Gacy then came stumbling back out of the restaurant, telling David to take him to his father's grave, where he was going to end it all.
Realizing that John Wayne Gacy was most likely about to attempt suicide, the cops decided to arrest him for the marijuana he'd slipped the gas station attendant, and boxed the car in, then leapt out with their guns drawn, surrounding the car, one officer jamming his pistol in Gacy's ear and saying, "We got you now, you jag-off."
Chapter 13. The Second Search.
As they were processing Gacy for the marijuana possession and securing a new search warrant, Gacy suddenly placed his hand over his chest and collapsed to the ground, saying,
My heart, my weak heart. Help me, I'm having a heart attack.
John Wayne Gacy was put into an ambulance and driven to the hospital, where they found nothing wrong with him. He faked it. Can you believe that? Meanwhile, police were serving the second search warrant and headed right into the dank, dark crawl space.
Space was completely flooded, and they had to turn on the sump pump to drain all the murky water out before dropping down through the trapdoor in the closet and into the subterranean place of darkness and death.
The first thing they noticed were clumps of extremely thin, bright red worms on the surface of the soil that dispersed when a flashlight beam shone on them. The officers had never seen worms like that before, and it struck them as odd.
Chicago cops may have never seen worms like that, but most folks who compost have run into these worms, maybe even bought them for vermicomposting. They're called ASIN fetida, and are decomposers that live near the surface of the soil, eating raw or slightly decayed organic matter, as opposed to those big fat earthworms that live deep in the ground and eat soil.
An officer randomly dug into the ground with a trenching tool and immediately pulled up a human shoulder bone, shouting up,
"Charge him! Murder!"
Soon they found a left femur, then another left femur, and another. 3 left femurs, meaning at least 3 bodies, all of which were much too decomposed to be Robert Piest.
It was then they realized they were onto something the scale of which they'd never seen before, and began removing the walls and floors to better access the crawl space, which they'd soon find was absolutely packed with the bodies of young men and teenagers.
Chapter 14. Excavation.
Meanwhile, against the advice of his lawyer, who told John to keep his mouth shut, Gacy began talking to the police, at first just asking if they'd been in the crawl space. When they said they had, he said,
Well, do you want me to rationalize it? Explain it? Okay. It started in 1972. Greyhound Busboy was the first one.
For the next 6 hours, John Wayne Gacy rambled on, describing in horrific detail each and every murder, including victims that he let go after raping and torturing them. Some were hustlers, male prostitutes, some were looking to score drugs, some he abducted at gunpoint, some were just typical high school kids lured to his house with the promise of a good-paying job.
Eventually, John would draw investigators a detailed map showing where each and every body was placed in the crawl space.
Even though investigators were finding bodies, they still harbored some disbelief over his confession. 33 victims? It seemed impossible. He had to be full of shit. No way this weird, fat clown had killed over 30 people.
But as the days passed, Christmas coming and going, John Wayne Gacy's map revealed itself to be extremely accurate.
Chillingly, later, Gacy would say to an investigator,
"You know, I told everyone 33, but I'll level with you. The real number, closer to 45.
As the blizzard descended, investigators worked with their fingers, pulling remains from the soil, unable to use shovels which could damage important trace evidence, uncovering bones and bodies with ruptured cavities, noxious gases rising, methane, hydrogen sulfide. A scent of death wafted out from the squat brick house of horror and permeated the neighborhood. A dank miasma, floating across the shoveled sidewalks and suburban streets of Norwood Park.
The press descended, as did hundreds of the morbidly curious, surrounding the House of Horrors, which was bathed in floodlights as body after body after body was pulled up from the muck and carted out in rubbery black body bags.
By the time the last body, the 29th, was pulled free, the house was nothing more than a shell, everything ripped apart in a search for evidence.
And finally, in April of 1979, when investigators felt they had found all there was to find, the house on 8213 West Somerdale Avenue was demolished.
By then, the story had spread across the globe, the highest death count in American history, and clowns would never be seen the same way again.
Chapter 15: The Trial.
Gacy spent over 300 hours with doctors at the Menard Correctional Center, undergoing a variety of psychological tests to determine whether he was mentally competent to stand trial.
Gacy attempted to convince the doctors that he had multiple personality disorder. He claimed to have 4 distinct personalities: the hardworking, civic-minded contractor, the clown, the politician, and a policeman called Jack Hanley, whom he referred to as Bad Jack, saying it was Bad Jack who committed all the murders.
Gacy told doctors that when he had confessed to police, he was just relaying the crimes of Jack, who detested homosexuality and viewed male prostitutes as weak, stupid, and degraded scum, ignoring the fact that many of his victims were just innocent teenagers looking for a job.
But, armed with this information, his lawyers had Gacy plead not guilty by reason of insanity. And I don't really believe any of that multiple personality bullshit. Hillside Strangler Kenneth Bianchi tried to play the same bullshit game till he got caught up in his own web of lies and gave it up.
But at the same time, some of the evidence is compelling. If you'd like a deep dive into the theory of Gacy's multiple personalities, read Buried Dreams Inside the Mind of John Wayne Gacy by Tim Cahill, who wrote the book with Gacy himself. It was one of our many sources and is listed in the show notes.
Gacy claimed he couldn't remember the killings because they'd been committed by Bad Jack, despite the fact that he'd given detailed confessions to his lawyers and police, including a map of where the bodies were buried.
The jury didn't believe any of it and deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Gacy guilty of 33 charges of murder, the most for which any person in U.S. history had been convicted at the time, sentencing him to death.
Chapter 16, Death Row. Gacy would sit on death row at the Menard Correctional Center for 14 long years, where he'd revel in his celebrity, becoming famous for his paintings of Elvis, clowns, skulls, and the Seven Dwarfs. I know it's kind of gross, but I would love to have one of those paintings. I just can't help myself.
He corresponded with many people, writing letters and talking on the phone, including infamous punk rocker G.G. Allin, as well as teenager Jason Moss. And if you want a further reveal into how devious, cunning, and manipulative John Gacy was, listen to episode 59 about Jason Moss.
Like everywhere else he'd ever been, Gacy was able to con, manipulate, and schmooze his way to the top of the food chain in prison, buttering up the warden, receiving special privileges. Despite his many confessions, in the end he claimed he didn't know anything about any murders, besides maybe the Greyhound busboy who'd been in self-defense, and implicated Michael Rossi and David Cram, saying that they had the keys to his house. Gacy would carry a huge binder around with him everywhere he went, pathetically saying it proved his innocence, acting as if it was he that was the real victim.
On the morning of May 9th, 1994, Gacy was transferred to Stateville Correctional Center to be executed. That afternoon, he was allowed a private picnic on the prison grounds with his family.
For his last meal, Gacy ordered a bucket of KFC, of course, French fries, a dozen fried shrimp, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke for the Colonel.
As the sun dipped down over the horizon and the shadows grew long, a Catholic priest gave the killer clown his last rites. He was then escorted to the execution chamber. In a bizarre coincidence, at the same exact time, in the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, Jeffrey Dahmer was being baptized.
John Wayne Gacy was strapped to a gurney and IVs were inserted into his arms. Over 1,000 people gathered outside, cheering the execution on, wearing t-shirts reading, "No tears for the clown."
At 12:40 a.m., the lethal injection procedure began, and the chemicals solidified in the tubes, which had to be replaced, causing the procedure to last a grueling 18 minutes. The last words of John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, were,
"Kiss my ass."
Chapter 17, Conspiracies and Possible Accomplices.
Immediately after his arrest, Gacy had implicated his employees Michael Rossi and David Cram in the murders, just right away throwing them under the bus.
At first, he said they were active participants. Then he modified his accusation to say they knew what they were doing when they were digging trenches in the crawl space and spreading lime, that he told them he needed holes for bodies.
Both boys vehemently denied this, but It's hard to believe they didn't have some inkling of what was going on. In particular, Michael Rossi, who lived there with them and even went out clowning with Gacy, dressed as Patches the Clown. Come on, Patches didn't know what Pogo was up to. One clown hand washes the other clown hand.
And how could he not have noticed the horrible smell, especially as he was down there digging the graves and spreading lime? And all the mementos of other boys lying around, John Cizik's television, Greg Godzik's class ring, the handcuffs and torture instrument.
And both Michael and David surely had to wonder what the hell had happened to John Bukovich and Greg Godzik. They knew that those kids didn't run away to California. Those kids weren't going anywhere. And Michael was literally driving John Cizik's car.
David Cram would take his own life in 2001. Was it guilt over the things he'd seen or done? We don't know. Michael Rossi is still alive today, but he is not saying anything and has denied interview requests for documentaries.
And in a further, utterly bizarre set of events, one of Gacy's employees, Robin Gecht, went on to become a serial killer as well. The leader of the infamous Chicago Rippers, a gang of sexual sadists who tortured and cannibalized 18 women from 1981 to 1982. I guess we're probably going to have to cover them at some point now, too. True crime author and good friend of the show, Nicole Phoenix, has actually been corresponding with Robin Gecht, she told us. Might get some new insights there.
Gacy would eventually claim his employees were committing crimes and burying bodies in his crawl space, saying that he was often out of town working, and they all had keys to his house, and came and went as they pleased. And there is evidence that he may have been out of town during one of the murders.
Yes, Robert Gilroy, whose body was found buried in the crawl space, went missing on September 15th. But on September 12th, Gacy had flown to Pittsburgh to supervise a remodeling project and did not return to Chicago until September 16th, a seeming alibi pointing to another murder.
Many see this as proof that Gacy had an accomplice, that he wasn't acting alone.
Of course, it's a time gap of around 24 hours, not that long, and Robert could have actually been abducted on the 16th, or the last person to have seen him could have gotten the date wrong by a day. So this in itself isn't definitive proof of anything.
Then there's Russell Nelson, who disappeared on October 17th, 1977. After he disappeared, a man called his mother saying he was a friend of Russell's and had been at the club with Russell when he went missing. He said he'd searched for him and would continue to do so, but needed money for expenses.
This mysterious man began harassing Russell's mother, demanding more and more money, eventually threatening her. And Russell's brothers then went to Chicago and actually met this guy. And while talking with them, he asked them if they were interested in construction jobs and said his friend John Wayne Gacy was hiring.
And then there's Philip Paskey, who'd worked for John Wayne Gacy. Philip Paskey was the right-hand man of John Norman, who ran the nationwide teenage boy sex trafficking ring, the Delta Project. John Norman was from Houston, Texas, and is believed to have ties with Dean Corll.
Yes, a direct connection between John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, and Dean Corll, the Candyman.
Dude, the 70s were so fucked. So disturbing. Literally makes my hair stand on end. But for now, we're out of time. We'll have to continue with this horrible connection next week.
Thank you, as always, for listening.
And I want to give a big shout out to some of the amazing musicians and bands featured in this week's episode. Komiku, Kelly Lattimore, and good friend of the show,
Donkey Cock. You can find links to all their music in the show notes. And do you have a band you'd like featured on the show? Do you have a case you'd like us to cover? You just want to say hi? Reach out to us at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. We will see you next week.